Hello everyone, I'm Kris. This is kind of going with the whole Oppenheimer thing, where the atomic bombing is necessary, the operations room, which I'm going to do this video next. So, let's, were they necessary?
Human history as much as the atomic bombing of Hiroshima on the 6th of August 1945. By the setting of the sun that day, the Pandora's box of nuclear weaponry had been opened, a city lay in ruins, and somewhere in the region of 100,000 Japanese civilians were killed or dying. 3 days later, on the 9th of August, the United States struck again, unleashing 22 kilotons of atomic energy against Nagasaki. The next day, the Japanese government communicated its intent to surrender to the Allies. On the 15th of
Just can't find a video quality that seems to not want to glitch on me. I'm getting annoyed.
15th of August, Emperor Hirohito addressed the Japanese people in an unprecedented radio broadcast announcing the unconditional surrender of the Empire of Japan, citing a new and cruel bomb that could result in the ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation. President Harry S. Truman and advocates of the atomic bomb had hoped that the use of these new weapons would bring the Second World War to a swift conclusion and prevent the need for an invasion of Japan. In other words, a necessary evil that would ultimately save lives. This effort appeared to be successful. This has been the traditional narrative of the end of the Second World War, and the argument that the use of the atomic bombs was for the greater good has been the traditional justification for their use ever since. Since the 9th of August 1945, numerous nuclear scientists, historians, political scientists, and other figures have debated this traditional narrative, and have called into question the justification and morality of using the atomic bomb against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The purpose of this video is not to take sides, but to provide an insight into the academic debate around the use of the atom bombs and the surrender of Japan. The immediate American reaction to the use of the first atomic bomb was largely positive, and this was joined by the overwhelming sense of relief after the end of hostilities on the 15th of August. At the Los Alamos Research Laboratory in New Mexico, the home of the Manhattan Project, the response to the Hiroshima bombing was one of celebration. Their years of work had paid off, and in a jubilant speech delivered to the mass scientists and staff, Project Director J. Robert Oppenheimer proclaimed that his only regret was that it hadn't been ready in time to use against the Germans. A minority of scientists were shocked by the first bombing and had hoped the US would demonstrate the weapon to the Japanese as a warning. The opinion of researchers and staff at Los Alamos changed after the bombing of Nagasaki. Shocked by its second use, many, including Oppenheimer himself, didn't understand why a second strike was needed, especially against a city of limited military importance. It is well known that had Japan not surrendered, the Allies would have launched Operation Downfall, the invasion of the Japanese home islands. This would have been the single largest amphibious landing in history. Often forgotten are the secondary operations which also would have occurred, such as British and Commonwealth forces commencing a full-scale liberation of Malaysia and Singapore under Operation Zipper. The Soviet Union was considering a far smaller limited landing in Hokkaido. The Japanese military anticipated this and strived to mobilize every last effort of their war machine to inflict as many casualties as possible on any invader, readying thousands of kamikaze aircraft and boats, and arming civilians to bolster the Japanese army. In July 1945, reflecting the brutality of the fighting on Okinawa and Iwo Jima, the US War Department assessed that American forces could suffer between 400,000 to 800,000 killed, with over 1 million more injured, and estimated millions of Japanese soldiers and civilians killed in exchange. One of the first official works that rejected the need for atomic bombs was the 1946 bombing survey. The survey team of politicians and subject matter experts was formed by the War Department in 1944 to study the effectiveness of strategic bombing in Europe and in the Pacific. Controversially, it contended that Japan would have surrendered as a result of continued conventional bombing and a naval blockade by the 1st of November 1945, the launch date for Operation Downfall.
Yeah, you could say that, but you don't necessarily know if that's a true statement. I see both sides. I understand why it probably should have been, and I understand why it shouldn't have been used. So I do see both sides. I think in the end, using that weapon is I'm more negative on it just because of where we are now. That doesn't necessarily mean that by not using the atomic bomb, we wouldn't have nuclear weapons today. That's everyone wanted one. It was bound to happen. But I would rather not have seen one used. But I also see the other side, watching the Pacific War series, where Japan is they're brutal. They're just a tough enemy. And I understand why it was used. But even after using the first one, I understand why Oppenheimer didn't understand why the second one needed to be used. But then again, at the end of the first one, after the first one, they were continuing. It was kind of business as usual. Or war as usual, I should say. So, yeah.
This has been questioned by many historians since, and in the survey itself, interviews with Japanese officials and military officers contradict this assessment, with many believing that the war would have continued until the end of 1946.
Yeah.
In December 1946, American physicist Carl T. Compton penned an article for The Atlantic titled, "If the Atomic Bomb Had Not Been Used." Compton had served as a military advisor to Truman on the atomic bomb and had met General Douglas MacArthur and his staff as they planned their part of Operation Downfall. While Compton readily agreed that Japan was beaten, he reiterated that Japan would not have surrendered, even in the face of an Allied invasion. He recalled the concern MacArthur's staff had, preparing themselves for the long, brutal fight ahead. Meeting with Japanese officers and soldiers during the Allied occupation, he observed a widespread attitude against surrender, that despite the overwhelming odds, Japanese forces would continue to resist by all possible means for as long as possible. Compton's piece is an example of the classic argument for the use of the atomic bomb, that, as inhumane as the weapon may have been, it ultimately saved lives through its destructive power and psychological impact. However, he argues this psychological impact was the efficiency of one bomb from one aircraft wreaking such destruction, plus the dread of many more rather than just the immediate damage, which explains the rationale for the second use against Nagasaki. Another popular counter-narrative.
Yeah. It's so difficult to do a report and say, yeah, they would have surrendered here, but you also have to look at how many lives would have been lost.
Another popular counter-narrative is that the Soviet invasion of Manchuria.
There's just so many things that if you're going to write a report, there are just so many things you can't ever account for. If the U.S. were to have an atomic bomb dropped on it from Japan, and then Japan were going to invade, I mean, I would fight. Even if I weren't a soldier at the time, I would fight, because it's an invasion of my country. So you're now involving people that weren't involved before, that are, and now it could be more casualties. So it's such a tricky thing.
Was the key factor in Japan's surrender. On the 8th of August 1945, just 2 days after Hiroshima, the Soviet Union declared war against the Empire of Japan. The next day, just a few hours before the bombing of Nagasaki, the Soviet Union launched a massive three-pronged offensive into Japanese-held Manchuria, intending to crush the million-man Japanese army that defended it. From its 4 years of fighting Germany, the Red Army had been sharpened from a stilted, wasteful mass into a hardened, motivated, and brutally effective behemoth. The once vaunted Kwantung Army fought hard, but stood little chance against the overwhelming firepower and aggression brought to bear by the highly mechanized forces of the Red Army. While the impending defeat of the Kwantung Army only made a bad situation worse, it was less the effectiveness of the Soviet attack and more the political shift that arguably changed the tide. As highlighted by renowned historian of nuclear weapons and disarmament advocate Ward Wilson, the entry of the Soviet Union removed a key political option for the Japanese. It was hoped that, since the Soviet Union had been neutral in the Pacific War under the terms of their non-aggression pact, they would be able to mediate for the Japanese and negotiate a conditional surrender with the Allied powers, which would let them keep their government, many of their conquered territories, and avoid prosecution for war crimes. A faction in the higher ranks of the Japanese army further supported the idea, believing that if they inflicted heavy losses on an American invasion, they could use the Soviet Union to negotiate from a position of strength. The news of Soviet tanks streaming across the Manchurian border on the morning of the 9th of August shattered such illusions. News of the bombing of Nagasaki reached the Japanese government's Supreme Council as it was holding an emergency meeting about the Soviet intervention. Yet, the bombing was only briefly discussed. Ward ascribes this to the fact that the bombings, while devastatingly efficient, caused destruction to life and property comparable to the regular B-29 firebombing raids against other Japanese cities. Thus, the damage itself would not have been uniquely shocking. In Ward's view, the Soviet...
It's kind of crazy that they're focusing on the USSR invading Manchuria over being bombed when, they were being firebombed, Curtis LeMay and the whole bombing situation. But that they were looking at this as, okay, well, it's just a bigger firebomb, and still focusing on Russia. Tells you that they really, I don't think they appreciated the bomb, which could be why a second one was necessary in the thinking of we've got to get their attention, because their attention seemed to be focused somewhere else. We got to get their attention so that they will stop. I can understand that. But at the same time, if the firebombing was working, I don't know.
Invasion meant there was now no good option available to Japan. Their options were now invasion, destruction, or surrender. Ward concludes quite simply that if the atomic bombs were not necessary because of this development, then it was wrong to use them. Following this, it is worth asking that if President Harry Truman knew of the Soviet intervention, why did he not postpone the strike against Nagasaki to assess the impact of the invasion of Manchuria on Japanese decision makers?
I think it was, my opinion, it was they're going to attack and then we're going to attack, and maybe Japan's going to look at it like, okay, well, there's a two-pronged, two countries are coming after us right now. So maybe that's going to put them on their heels, because also Canada, England was always, England, even though they were dealing with that, England's like, all right, war's not over. We got to help them. Help them as in they got to help the Americans. Canada's always involved. I wouldn't doubt Australia may not have been involved militarily, but they were probably involved with allowing staging. So, this is when, if you're Japan, this is when it gets scary, because this is now your allies are done. Now all the attention is on you. And now you're going to start to get overwhelmed. Yeah.
Widely lauded book, Racing the Enemy, Stalin, Truman and the Surrender of Japan, Japanese-American historian Tsuyoshi Hasegawa asked this question and highlights that, despite the time zone difference between Washington DC and the Mariana Islands, and technology available to send messages, Truman could well have intervened to prevent the strike, yet from all of the White House papers and historical evidence, it appears no one considered the possibility. Hasegawa goes on to argue that, since the Japanese Supreme Council barely registered the bombing of Nagasaki, and the intelligence reports that feared the US could have 100 atomic bombs caused very little concern, It was unlikely that a third or even fourth atomic bomb would have caused Japan to surrender, and that it was the Soviet intervention and the new political reality that it brought with it which brought about the end of the war. In his own appraisal of the atomic bombings, prompt and utter destruction, American historian of nuclear weapons and power, J. Samuel Walker, admirably attempts to find alternative perspectives. He reframes the debate by arguing that Truman was looking for a way to end the war as quickly and as painlessly as possible. He was not looking for a way to avoid using the nuclear bomb. It also must be remembered that in the context of a massive strategic firebombing campaign against major Japanese cities, there was already a moral question. Using a more effective weapon to achieve the same effect was not regarded as a particularly different or unique moral question by Truman or American decision makers. It was simply a more effective means of bringing about the end of the war as quickly as possible. He also answers Hasegawa's question of why Truman never thought to postpone the bombing of Nagasaki after the Soviet invasion of Manchuria. Walker points to the fact that through early 1945, US planners sought a Soviet intervention to tie down Japanese troops in Manchuria, but assessed that their intervention alone would not be enough, and would have to be coupled with an American landing on mainland Japan to be enough of a shock to prompt Japan's surrender. In the closing chapters of his book, Walker highlights an issue often overlooked, the uncomfortable topic of racism. Writing an Observer article for The Guardian newspaper in 2020, British academic Kenan Malik delves deeper into the issue. Malik highlights the distinctively dehumanizing view many American servicemen undoubtedly held regarding the Japanese, quoting examples of how Marines and airmen often referred to their enemies. He suggests that these widespread attitudes made the use of atomic weapons against Japan more palatable to American policymakers.
I would say that Japan probably held the same thing about white people, Americans. Yeah. When you're looking at something that isn't, let's say it was, well, this is a prime example. The U.S. probably, back then, considered more white. Japan, Asian. Yeah, I would say there probably was some sort of racist belief. I don't think that's going to dictate whether you drop an atomic bomb on an enemy or use nuclear weapons. But I also can't say it's not a reason why they would have used it. Does that make sense? I think if you replace Japan with England, the U.S. does not nuke them or doesn't drop the atomic bomb. But but that's not because white. I guess that's more because we have a shared history. So that's a terrible example. France, yeah, France. I don't see them. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Yeah. Because later on, with Korea, there was the thought of using them then to go against China. Yeah. Look, and I'm not defending the man who had the buck stops here, Harry Truman. Harry Truman. I'm not defending it. I'm not defending the action. But Harry Truman was racist. It is what it is. So it could have been, an excuse.
You take the position that it was justified or not, the use of atomic weapons against Japan changed the military landscape forever.
I'll say this. The next president was Dwight Eisenhower. I think Eisenhower has an appreciation of war, and that's not just Harry Truman was in World War I, so he understands the horror of war. I think if Dwight Eisenhower were president, he does not use the atomic bomb. And the reason I say that is because Eisenhower had seen so much of war and knows how devastating it is. And I don't think he would have allowed himself to use it. He probably would have continued with the firebombing in association with working with the Soviets to really make Japan look at it like we don't have any allies left. Like, it's just us. But I could be wrong on that too. I'm just speculating. You know, it's just difficult.
The devastating power of the bomb has since served as a deterrent from costly armed conflict between nuclear powers. While this clearly didn't factor into the decision-making at the time, it is an interesting question to ponder. If the use of the bomb against Hiroshima and Nagasaki was justified because it saved more lives than it took, how many lives have been saved by the bombings in the years since 1945 through the power of deterrence?
That's a good question.
He knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
Wow. I mean, the people who invented the bombs, I mean, they had to be, there was an excitement, and then there is a horror when you see it used. 80,000 to 100,000 people at Hiroshima evaporated in 1 second. I mean, that's a lot of lives. Yeah, it's I don't even have an answer. I don't know. I guess I could sit here and convince myself that it was necessary, and then I can turn around and convince myself why it wasn't. I see both sides. Yeah. Well, I'm going to end it here. Like and subscribe, and until the next time or the next video, have a good day, have a good night.